Good afternoon. This is Friday, October the 9th. Friday afternoon. Last thing I'm going to do before I finally leave school, I want to talk a little bit about the assignment on population growth comparing reindeer population to human population. The assignment is Ecology Population Dynamics number 10. Also, I want to talk a little bit about what's called the demographic transition and age structure pyramids. You'll see all of these listed in the learning objectives for Monday's test, or Tuesday, depending what hour you're in. So if you are in, just a reminder, if that you are in second or third hour, you will be taking your test on Monday. If you're a virtual student, you will get your test link during our normal Google Meets. If you are in fifth or sixth hour, you either already took it today, or you, as a virtual student, will be taking it on Tuesday and get your test link again during our normal Google Meet. So let me jump into the activity. You might want to pull this activity out if you have it on paper or up on your screen if you did it online. Going to sort of walk through some of the key stuff. So sharing my screen. And this is the activity that I'm talking about. So in this activity, we're comparing some real data. We're looking at data from a reindeer population on an island 200 miles off the coast of Alaska in the Bering Sea. If you've ever seen the show Deadliest Catch, that's the Bering Sea. It's a very rough sea, very choppy sea, very cold water. And so these deer have been living on this island that's 200 miles off the mainland. After we take a look at the reindeer population, we're going to take what we learned from that story, which again is a real situation, and apply it to our own population. Right? So we have learned about population. We've learned about ways we can measure population, density, distribution, exponential growth, logistical growth. And then we applied that to several scenarios. We went first to the Serengeti and looked at a population study that's 50 years old on the Serengeti and learned about density-dependent, density-independent variables, as well as top-down and bottom-up variables. We then moved a little south into Mozambique, into Gorongosa, and looked at the first ever continent-wide elephant African survey and different types of surveys, such as aerial surveys, individual registration surveys, acoustic surveys, dung transects. And then we introduced you through a simulation to mark and recapture and quadrat. And now we are going into our own population. And so it's a transition to our own population. We're looking at this deer population in Alaska, and then we'll look at our own population. So as I scroll down, here's the graph. This was a study done between 1910 and 1950. Don't let that throw you off because it's an older study. It's a still very accurate study and applies to almost all populations. So 1911, as it tells us, we had 25 reindeer, 4 males and 21 females. And I'm not going to go through all these step by step, but you can see I have in the boxes in blue what should be the correct answers. So feel free to make some adjustments if you need to. But we can see from 1911 to 1920, we averaged 19.4 gain of reindeer per year. And here we are, 1911 to 1920, nice, slow, steady incline. We're only growing about 19-20 deer per year. Then as we move down, we go to the next time period, 1920 to 1930. And if we do our calculations correctly, we have an average of about 20 reindeer per year, about a whole deer more per year. And that on the graph, if I go back, is right here. Still a pretty slow, steady growth. Little dip in here in the early 20s. Not sure what that is, but it could be a number of factors. But in general, the population is growing very slow and steady until we hit 1930. And in 1930, which here's our calculations for 1930, all of a sudden we go from 20 deer a year to 200 deer per year. 200 deer per year. we had our max population of 2,000 in 1938. What the heck is going on in 1930 that all of a sudden goes from 20 deer a year to 200 deer per year? No, not likely an increase in food. The food resources have probably been pretty stable. There's probably actually abundant food because the population hasn't been very big. Water, space, all that stuff is probably not an issue. The key factor is at this point, we have a large number of reproducing females. When it comes to a population's growth, the female is more critical. Guys, you're basically a dime a dozen. Doesn't take very many of you to cause the population to grow, especially if you're a herding animal. It's the females that are critical because the females are the ones that carry the offspring. So in the beginning of the study in 1911, we got about 20 females. If they were all mature enough to reproduce, we're not going to get much more than 15 to 25 deer per year. And in fact, we're averaging about 19 deer per year. But by the time we get to 1930, we're at 400 deer. Statistically, that means about half the deer should be females. So there's about 200 females. Now, they're probably not all old enough to breed, but probably 3/4 of them would be. So say about 150 females versus 21 females. 150 females, each having 1 or 2 does. Bingo, you're up to 300-400 deer per year. So that's the most critical factor, is that we reach a point where we have a large, mature female population that's capable of breeding. And because the resources have not been stressed, because the resources are in abundant supply, wham, the population shoots straight up. And that's exactly what we're seeing here in 1930 when we hit 400, and then whoa, straight on up. Straight on up it goes. But right at 1938, when we hit a peak of 2,000, look what follows. We have a crash. We have a big crash right after 1938. And if we did the calculations correctly, we ended up with a negative 166 reindeer per year. Negative means the population is shrinking. So we were growing 200 reindeer per year between 1930 and 1938. We're shrinking almost as quickly right after 38 at 166 reindeer per year, all the way down to 8 reindeer, less than what we had when we started and introduced them in 1911. So that brings us to some questions to think about this. So it says, could immigration have played a role during determining the size of the reindeer population? Are we going to have deer moving into the island or onto the island, or deer moving off the island? Think for a moment. No, this is an island 200 miles out in the Bering Sea, a very rough sea. These reindeer are not swimming 200 miles. They don't got magic dust from Santa Claus. They're not flying. There's no ice jams or ice flows that are going to go 200 miles to where they can walk across. So these deer are stuck. This is their island. This is the only space they've got, which means this is the only resources they have. They have very limited resources. So odds of them moving very, very, very little. 2, we just answered a second ago. Larger number of females was a key to the population growing. Remember, you can pause the video anytime if you want to look at these in more detail. What effect might 2,000 reindeer have had? Why did we have the crash? Why did we have the crash? Some people brought up disease. Possibly a new disease came up, and with higher density, it could have spread very quickly. Some people mentioned predators, but there are no predators currently on the island. There's no hunting on the island currently. It's too far out. So yeah, the most likely thing that's going on is they've overwhelmed the vegetation. 2,000 deer were eating the vegetation. The key is they were eating the vegetation faster than it could replace itself. And if you're eating the vegetation, the food, faster than it can replace itself, of course, you're going to have the food supply collapse. And that's probably what's happened here to see such a steep drop. Food supply completely collapses, and we have mass death. all the way down to 8 reindeer. What would have normally been limiting factors? What would have normally have kept these guys in check? As I already mentioned, food resources normally would keep them in check. And so if they were depleted, starvation would hit. Disease, we already mentioned. These are 2 possibilities, not the only 2 possibilities. And so if we have 8 deer left in 1950, just 8 deer left in 1950, what's possibly going to, and some of them are male and some of them are female, what might happen? Well, as long as you got some males and you got some females, they're probably going to start building the population back up. Will they build all the way back up to 2,000? Highly unlikely. Resources haven't had enough time to recover. That's far above what we now call the carrying capacity. So this population probably would recover and maybe up to a few hundred deer. And maybe then it could stabilize and do okay. Another factor that they looked at when studying the DC deer is what's called the doubling time. So these doubling times, I just went to the graph and did my best interpretation. Your years might be a year or 2 earlier or a year or 2 later. That's okay. But I went back to the graph and I had to figure out, when did we hit 50? So 50 somewhere right about here. So I figured about 1912. And then when did we hit 100? 100's right about there, about 1915. So that's where these numbers down here come from. And then we just took the difference to get the doubling time. The doubling time is the time it takes the population to double. So the first time we went from 1911 to 1912 is when we doubled. That was 1 year. Then we went from 50 to 100 deer in 3 years. Then we went from 100 to 200 in 5 years. Then we went from 200 to 400 in 10 years. So in those first 20 years, doubling time was getting longer and longer. Doubling time was slowing down. Thus, we had the slow, steady growth in the graph. But right around 1930, look what happens to doubling time. Boom, it drops, 3-3. When your doubling time starts getting quicker, your doubling time starts getting faster, it's decreasing, you are entering exponential growth. And again, if we go back up to this graph, doubling time's getting higher, doubling time's getting higher, doubling time's decreasing, boom, all of a sudden doubling time's decreasing, and away we go. So doubling time at first was increasing, by 1930 started decreasing. What evidence do we have that we went over the carrying capacity? Going again back up to the graph, this crash right here, boom. You went over the carrying capacity. When you see a steep, rapid decline, you know you went past this carrying capacity. Carrying capacity probably is somewhere around 1,600, probably somewhere right in here. And we just went too far over, and that caused the collapse of the food supply. If something would have kept us around 1,500, the deer probably would have been just fine. Well, what could have kept them around 1,500 naturally? And that's where it's important to have what we call a check. We have to have something that keeps the population in check. Most naturally would be something like a predator, some wolves. Or if the island was more accessible, human hunting could also be an effective way to keep a check on the population and keep it under control. So we come back down, whoops, we went too far, come back down here. So the evidence we hit the carrying capacity is there's a crash after 1938. What does it tell us about unchecked populations? And every population we study shows the same pattern. If a population is unchecked, you take away the normal controls, they're going to grow exponentially. They're going to exceed their carrying capacity. And as a result, they're going to deplete the resources and crash. We see this pattern over and over and over again. No checks. We grow exponentially. We exceed carrying capacity. Resources collapse. The population crashes. What difference would hunting or predators have made? They would have slowed down the exponential growth. The predators or the humans would have provided, so if this is the population growing, they would have provided the resistance, the environmental resistance, to keep it from going too far. They could have kept it below the carrying capacity, which would have brought it into balance. And so that becomes the lesson of the deer. The lesson of the deer is exactly that. If you take away the checks, the population grows exponentially, and without checks, it's going to grow beyond the carrying capacity. And when you go past the carrying capacity, resources are going to collapse, and that's going to cause the population to collapse. That's the lesson from the reindeer. So then we go to the human population, and we were asked to graph the human population. I just made this one quickly on the computer. A lot of students the biggest mistake I see with a lot of students is they want to put the year 1 and then the year 1000. And you end up with a graph that goes something like this. Totally wrong. Remember, you have to go in equal increments, equal increments. So here I went by 500ths, and here I went by thousands. You can't go 1, 1,000, 1,200, 1,300. You can't have them be worth different values. I hope that makes sense. So we can see from this graph, what can you tell me about human population? Well, for most of our history, our population growth has been very slow and very steady. Not till about the 1800s, then all of a sudden it cranks up and we go into exponential growth. And we have currently been in exponential growth for about the last century and a half. It took us till 1825 approximately to reach 1 billion people. It took us 1,825 years to reach 1 billion people. Within the next couple of years, we're going to hit 8 billion. We will have doubled our population 3 times in over a century, in just over a century. We've never seen growth like this. So what has it got in common with the reindeer? Well, the reindeer also started out slow. And the reindeer also went into an exponential phase. And the question is, will humans follow a similar pattern as a result? That's the question we've been dealing with at least since the 1970s. So let's look at doubling time. Again, I would have gone to the chart in the graph. Your numbers might be slightly different. These are estimates. So we had about 500 million people in 1700. We had 1 billion in 1825. We had 2 billion in 1925, and we hit 4 billion in 1970. And we are currently at about 7.9 billion. We'll be hitting 8 billion probably around 2021, 2022, somewhere in that range. So then if we look at the doubling time, first time to double, 1,700 years. Then 125 years, then 100 years, then 45 years. Our doubling time is decreasing dramatically. Like I said, we were going to end up doubling almost 3 times in 1 century. That's huge. That's huge. It took us 1,700 plus years to double the first time. Now we're going to double 3 times in 100 years. That's a huge increase. So our doubling time is decreasing. It's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and we are doubling faster and faster and faster. As a result, human population is growing rapidly. We're in an exponential growth phase. On your graph, you were supposed to extend it out to 2040 and make a prediction. I said about 8.2. I think my estimate's probably a little low. It's probably going to be more like 8.5 to 9 would be my guess. And then there was this formula right here, which I messed up. Let me fix that. I put the wrong year value in there. Okay. I'm just correcting a mistake I made earlier. So I'm just plugging in population for 2020. If I look in the table above, it's 7,800 or 7,800 million. And then I'm going to subtract 2,000 from the chart. That's 6,034 million. Times that by 100. Divide that by 2,000 population times 20 years, because that's how many years it is between 2,000 and 220. And we get this growth rate value. That's what we're getting, a rate of growth. That's our rate of growth is 1.32. We're growing about 1.32% a year. Doesn't sound like much, but when you're at 8 billion people and you're growing over 1% a year, you're adding 800 million new people every year. 1%, you're adding 800 million new people every year. So we're still growing. Now, we've been doing this activity, honestly, for about 30 years. And when we were first doing this activity, our growth rate was up around 1.7, 1.8. About 10, 15 years ago, it started dropping to about 1.5. Now we're down to 1.3 because we are slowing our growth rate. But there's so much momentum in the system, we're still producing large numbers of offspring. It takes a while for this all to slow down. So if nothing changes, we can figure out the next time our population should double. So right now we're at 2020, we're around 7.8 billion. In our doubling time, we take 70 divided by the rate of growth, says we should double again around the year in about 50 years. So if we take 2020 and add 50 years, about the year 2070, we would hit double what we're currently at. We'd hit a little over 15 billion people. 15 billion. There's nobody around that thinks Earth can support 15 billion. All the experts say that's not possible. There's not enough resources to support 15 billion. We knew back in 1970, we needed to curtail this somewhere around 10 billion. If you watch the video that you should have watched with Hans Rowling, he makes the case that we could probably support 11 billion people. And 15 billion is going to be tough. And with 15 billion, that probably means every other living thing on the planet's gone. And do we want to create a planet where we're the only living species? There's a big project currently going on called Half Earth. And the whole concept of Half Earth is we agree as a world to make sure we set aside half the world's land and half the world's oceans and waterways for wildlife, so that there is a place for wildlife to always exist on Earth, not just a human presence. And 15 billion is not going to make that work. So we're going to come back to, okay, it's a problem. I don't want this to be doom and gloom. We're going to come back to, okay, what do we do to change that? What do we do to fix that? Individually, in the last half century, countries have come into balance. Countries have. Germany, Italy, France, England, Canada, Japan, on some level the US. But the problem is too much of the world is not in balance. And we have to get everybody in balance to bring our population under control. And again, most experts are pushing for a carrying capacity somewhere around 10, 11 billion. That's our best educated estimate. So we already talked about this question here. If you compare the two graphs, we both have slow, steady growth when compared to the reindeer, and we both have exponential growth. And then you can make a comparison to humans on Earth and deer on the island. Like the deer on the island, we got nowhere else to go. Current technology, we cannot immigrate or emigrate to Earth or from Earth. Who knows, maybe down the road, technology, we can colonize the moon, we can build underwater cities, but right now those are not realistic options. Therefore, we also have limited resources. The resources that are on Earth are the only resources we have to work with, at least under current conditions. And humans, like any other population, require food, water, shelter, habitats. Here's the question I just talked about. Does the Earth have a carrying capacity? Almost certainly, because we know there's a limited number of resources on the planet. And again, our best estimate is 10 to 11 billion. We don't know that for sure, but that's our best estimate. So if we go back up to this human graph, really it becomes a story of what could happen. There's really three scenarios that could happen. And many think that we have about a 20, 30-year window left to make that happen. Not a 50-year window, but we have about a 20, 30-year window to make some really key decisions to either get this in control or run the risk of it becoming out of control. So one thing that could happen, of course, is the population could continue to grow and we don't have a problem. Some people say, what are you worried about? Technology will solve it. Many feel that we've probably pushed the limits of technology already. We're not sure we can, with technology, expand the carrying capacity that significantly, but it's possible. Of course, the other thing we could do is keep growing and hit our carrying capacity and crash, which I don't think anybody wants to get into that situation. We would be talking about millions and millions and millions of people dying. The third option, which is the one we prefer, is we grow a little bit and we finally get ourselves into balance. We get that logistical S curve. Again, we think that can possibly be done at 10 to 11 billion people. So how do we get to that S curve? How do we create the balance is what we're going to take a look at. So I've left these two blank on purpose because we're going to talk about that in a few moments. Worldwide, some of the countries that are still trying to get there are the poorer countries you see in Africa and South America. Some of the countries that have already made the transition and brought themselves back into balance again are places like Italy and France. And population increase does increase competition. Competition for jobs, increases competition for clean water, for healthy foods, creates a burden on pollution. So there is many strong reasons to bring population under control. So we have to do something called the demographic transition. Demographic comes from the word demography. Demography is the study of populations. So demographic transition is really just a population transition. So let me bring up a whiteboard. I'm going to have to make a switch here for 1 second. So I'm going to bring up a whiteboard that we can write on. And I'm going to try to explain what this demographic transition is. All right, what did I do with my pencil? Whoops. Okay. So I'm going to make a, whoops, good enough. I'm going to make a graph. Okay. And I'm going to divide it into 4 sections. Now, this may not end up being perfectly straight and beautiful, but you'll get the idea. And one more. All right. So this is stage 1. Let me get rid of that one. This is stage 2. This is stage 3. This is stage 4. Okay. I'm going to use a couple different colors. I'm going to have red be death, green be birth rate. So red's going to be death rate, green's going to be birth rates, and blue is going to be population growth. So stage 1 is early human history. And in early human history, did we do anything to control birth? No. Birth rates were high. If you look at the average number of children that women were having, it was a pretty high rate. So birth rates were up here. That was not a big deal because so were death rates. So I got a high birth rate, I got a high death rate. They balance each other out. And so if I got a high birth rate and I've got a high death rate, my population is in balance. And it's at a fairly low level. And that's what we saw for the first 1,700 years. Well, around late 1800s, early 1900s, things started to shift. The late 1800s, we get into the Industrial Revolution. We go from primarily everybody being farmers to a huge portion of the population becoming city dwellers and factory workers. And we mechanize farming. We replace animals with machines. The upside of that is we massively increase food production. So we got better food production. We're at about 1.5 billion people, which means we now have probably about 600 million females that are capable of having children. So just like the deer, we have this critical number of females, and we've got a good food supply. We've got better access to resources. And as we get into the 1900s, comes the biggest shift. Because what's kept us with high death rates all these years? For 1,700 years, why were we so flat? We don't have a predator in a sense, but what's kept us in check? And that's infectious disease. Infectious disease is what kept us in check most of our history. Viruses, bacteria, protozoans. But by the 1900s, we developed vaccines, antibiotics, modern medicine. And all of a sudden, infectious disease is suppressed. It's been suppressed significantly. And so what changes? What changes is our death rate. Our death rate all of a sudden plummets. Our death rate plummets, but the problem is we don't change our birth rate. And so now you got this, we were balanced, birth rate, death rate, and now death rate plummets, birth rate goes up, and we got a big gap. Way more births than deaths. That means your population is going to do what? That means your population is going to grow, and it's going to grow rapidly. You're going to go from being in balance to going exponential. And this is where we were through most of the 1900s. Again, some of us since the mid-1900s, US, Japan, Canada, most of Europe, started to make that demographic transition that was necessary. And that's what happens in stage 3. Stage 3 is where we make this demographic transition. So as death rates have leveled out, we haven't been able to push death rates much lower. And we're not sure that we actually ever will be able to push them much lower. So you got two options. You're out of balance. You got low death rates and you got high birth rates. So you either have to bring your death rates up or you got to bring your birth rates down. One's better than the other. I would hope it's pretty obvious bringing death rates up is not the most humane choice. We don't want to kill more people. So what we've been focused on is how do we bring that birth rate down? We got to bring that birth rate down to match the death rate. And that is the transition. And what the countries I mentioned have been able to do in stage 3 is they've been able to take this birth rate and drop it down to be equivalent to the death rate, which is causing their populations to go into balance. Now we're back into that S curve. Now we're back into that S curve. So countries that I've mentioned like Japan, Canada, Britain, Germany, they have been doing this the last 20, 30 years, last several decades. For birth and death, the US has been doing that for the last several decades. However, our population continues to increase because of immigration. The need, the desire for lots of people to come in to our country. So in order to solve this, we need to bring other countries through the demographic transition. So we've got countries like China and India, which I'm just drawing these purple dots. They are in the process of transitioning. The two biggest countries in the world. China is about 2 billion, India is about 1 billion. This is about a third or greater of the population of the world. And as they make this transition, they're becoming better educated, they're becoming stronger societies, they're becoming wealthier societies, and they want a seat at the table that has been occupied by the US and Europe all these years. They want the same things you want. They want that iPhone, they want that computer, they want the good job. This is what's creating so much pressure on jobs and economy in our country, and why some people are freaking out about immigrants and all this other stuff, is because there's increased competition. China and India are no longer willing to sit to the side and just take what's left over. They want an equal seat at the table. In order to make more room at the table, the rest of us have to give a little. And that's making people very, very uncomfortable. And you can understand it. You can understand it. Other countries, some of the poor African countries, some of the poor South American countries, they're still over here in phase 1, right? And again, here's Europe, here's the US, here's Japan. We're sitting over here. I shouldn't have put them in phase 4. We're actually at the bottom of phase 3. So how do you do that? So experts studied what happened in Europe, what happened in the US, what happened in Japan, what happened in Canada, what made us able to get through the transition, which took us about 75 years. And what it all came down to is not something most people think of right away. It came down to 2 things. 1, women's rights, and 2, child welfare. We found that when women have rights and children are taken care of and education is the emphasis, family sizes naturally drop. You don't have to make any laws. You don't have to force anybody to do anything. Everybody can make whatever choice they want about their family size. Some will still have bigger families. Some will have smaller families. But what we find is when people have the choice, family size naturally drops. It naturally goes down. If you're a woman and you have the right to vote, you have the right to get an education, you can own property, you can be a functioning member of society, you tend to have fewer children because you're more occupied doing other things as well. But if you're living in a male-dominated society where you have none of these rights, you're basically the property of the husband, and that's the only role you're given is to have children, you tend to have much larger families. You tend to have much larger families. So we see that people that are living in that situation, 4 to 6 children per family or more. People that live in a place where women are treated well, we see family size more around 2. Naturally happens. Same thing with children. If your children are costing you money, which you are costing your mom and dad money because they're putting an emphasis on raising you and getting you educated, and they're willingly paying money to support you, but that is going to determine how many kids you have because it's expensive. It's expensive. And so if they're having to pay your way, that's going to affect the number of kids they have. They naturally tend to have fewer kids. But if you're an asset, which means you're going to make money to support the family, people tend to have more kids. I mean, in the US, we did that through the 1800s. Most of us were farmers. We had larger families, free labor on the farm. It's a normal response. Early 1900s, kids were going out at 10, 11, 12 years old before we had child labor laws and working in factories, sweatshops, and bringing some income home for the parents. That doesn't exist now, or very little exists now. You know, unfortunately, I know sometimes today still we have teenagers that need to work and help with family expenses, and unfortunately that does happen, but that's a minority. That's a smaller number. Today, most teenagers are not in a situation where they have to work to meet the family's basic needs. You're not a moneymaker for the family. And if you are a moneymaker for the family, families tend to have more kids. I'm hoping that's making some sense. So it's really as simple as encourage countries, do everything we can with countries to grant women, empower women, give women the rights they deserve, and treat children more as a liability than an asset. I know it's strange to think from here, but over 50% of the females in the world live in the situation where they don't have any rights. Over 50% of the women in the world don't vote, cannot get an education, et cetera, et cetera. And so getting other countries to go through that transition is going to take some time. You can't just walk into a country and say, what you're doing doesn't work, you need to do this. People don't make a shift that quickly, and we're running out of time. So the more we can get people to make adjustments, the more we can get people to open up their societies for women and children, the faster we can get through the demographic transition. It's really, all the data shows it's really that simple. Give women choices and options. Make education a priority for the children, and you'll see family sizes come down. Now, convincing other countries that have different sets of values that that's important is the challenge. So I hope that makes some sense as well. Last thing I'll say on this is we're starting to see a phase 4. And what we're seeing in phase 4 is the death rates staying steady, but the birth rates in some of these countries is doing this. It's dropping below the death rate. Well, now if your birth rate's lower than your death rate, what is the country doing? It's shrinking, it's getting smaller. Italy, France, 2 places where this is a real concern. They're getting an inverted pyramid. They are losing population. And they're actually doing somewhat opposite of the China policy. They are offering incentives, payments, et cetera, for people to actually get married and have children, because they're concerned they're going to lose their culture. The other issue they're having, we know we have fights in this country about immigration and who should immigrate, who shouldn't immigrate, and all that good stuff. I don't want to get down the political road. But it's probably more intense in Europe. Places like Italy and France, because their populations are shrinking, they don't have enough people to fill all the jobs they have in their country. Well, if you can't fill all the jobs you have in your country, what do? You go out and you invite people to come into your country and fill those jobs. And so Europe also has a large immigrant population that is moving into these countries by invitation to fill these jobs. And the tension is most of the immigrants coming in are wanting to keep their culture. And the native Italians and native French are afraid that those cultures are going to overlap their cultures and they're going to lose the Italian or French culture. And so that's creating a lot of the same tension and headbutting we see here in the US. So that's a little bit about the demographic transition. The key is we need to get as many countries as possible through phase 3. And if we can get as many people through phase 3 as possible, this is what we'll create. We'll create a balance somewhere around 10 to 11 billion. And that we think is sustainable and still allows room and space for wildlife. Okay, almost there. I'm going to share a couple slides with you and then we'll wrap this up. I'm sort of cramming 2 to 3 days into as much as I can right now. So these are some slides that I shared in class. This is a more nicely made graph of what I just drew on the whiteboard. Right? Same story, population, death rate, birth rates are even, thus we're steady. Death rates drop because of modern medicine, good sanitation, clean water. Birth rates, however, remain high. So we've got this big gap, so population starts to explode. Those that went through the transition have dropped their birth rates back down to their death rates, and in those countries, the population's leveling out. We need that population to level out, not just in those countries, but worldwide. Enough said there. The other way we can measure this is we use what's called a population pyramid. This is a population pyramid. It looks somewhat like a pyramid. The way you read this, look at the bottom, there's a percent population. And so it goes from 0, 2%, 4%, 6%, 8%. Same thing the other way, 2%, 4%, 6%, 8%. The difference in the color, which this thing is blocking, is one side represents the females. So this grayish side represents the females, and this peach side represents the males. And it's broken into age cohorts. This is an age structure pyramid. So how much of your population is age 0 to 4? How much of your population is age 5 to 9? How much of your population is age 10 to 14? So forth and so on. So if I look at, say, 5 to 9, I can see 5 to 9, the males make up just under 8%. Just under 8% of my population in this country is male, age 5 to 9. Over here, females, a little bit closer to 8. There's not much difference, but 5 to 9 females is right about 8%. So in total, add the guys about 8%, add the girls about 8%. In total, 16%. That's a big chunk. 16% of this country's population is only 5 to 9 years old. And if I take the youngest age brackets here, that right here, about 50% of the population, about 50% of this population is 14 years old or younger. Over half the country is under 14 years old. That is a sign of a very fast reproducing, fast growing country. This is typical of a stage 1 country. What can you say about the older folks? There ain't very many of them. This country has a high death rate, not a long life expectancy, because there isn't too many that are making it past 50. You start getting into the 50s, these boxes start getting really small. So this graph tells me this is a developing country. This is an emerging country. It is very young because of very high birth rates, and people don't live very long. There's a fairly low life expectancy in this particular country. This would be typical of the poor countries in Africa and South America. Hopefully you can see how you would read that. Here's one that's of the entire world population. You can see this one's a little fatter, a little bit wider. All right. Here it's not doing it by percent, it's doing it by population in millions. Right. So we can see there's much more consistency in age brackets from about the ages of 39 down. So we got a lot more people that are in their 20s and 30s, a lot more people in their 40s and 50s. You can see life expectancy worldwide is much better. Once you get above 80, it starts to drop pretty quickly, but can't live forever. But this is just another way that you could look at a population graph. Here's the typical patterns you see. This first one is the rapid growth, very wide base, very narrow top. This is high birth rate, high death rates, rapid growth. Kenya, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia are some of the examples of countries that are currently doing this. Slow growth, that's really where US is, Australia is, Canada is. You can see it's starting to become a little bit more boxy, less of a pyramid. As it's becoming a little bit more boxy, the birth rate's not near as big as it is over here. Life expectancy is a little bit better. These are countries that are going through the demographic transition. They're going from phase 2 to phase 3. Zero growth are countries that have made it through the transition. You're now almost a box until you get to the very oldest ages, which means each generation is about the same size as the generation before it. You're simply just replacing the generation before you. And that's creating slow, steady growth. Countries like Denmark, Austria, Italy, all European countries, these are countries that have completed the transition all the way through stage 3. And then, as I already mentioned, in phase 4, some countries are getting into what's called a negative growth phase. Notice the bottom of the pyramid is now skinnier than the top. You are having fewer children than you have people dying. So if you're having less births and more deaths, your population is getting smaller and smaller. This population is going to continue to shrink unless something at the bottom changes for these countries. And that's why they're offering incentives for people to have bigger families. Hopefully that's making some sense. Last slide. So if we tie these together, we can tie these two things together. Here's the pyramid, the sharp pyramid. That's stage 1. high birth rates, high death rates. As you drop the death rates, it starts to widen at the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages start to widen, you have people living longer, right? It's more of a true pyramid. As you get to phase 3, it starts to become a little bit more boxy because we're now starting to even out the birth rates with the death rates. And then eventually you get almost into a complete box except for the top. That means you've made the transition. And again, a few countries have gone the way where they're inverting the pyramid because they're shrinking. So I think you can see the correlation between these two things. So bottom line, we want to bring our population in balance so we can be sustainable and have a healthy planet. We got to get that, we have to get this down to a 10 to 11 billion. And the way we can do that is supporting organizations that promote women's rights, that promote child advocacy and child welfare, and that work with countries to get them to empower women and make children a priority. That seems to be the biggest success of all these countries that are over here. That's exactly what they did. It's exactly what they did. You know, I think we sometimes forget it wasn't that long ago, 60, 70 years ago, women in the US didn't have a whole lot of rights. It wasn't, you know, I don't remember the exact year, but it wasn't until like the 1980s or 1990s women could even get a credit card in their own name. My own mother wanted to go to college out of high school in the 1950s, and my grandfather wouldn't send her. He just thought it was silly to spend money to send a female to college. So we've gone through the same struggles here. We just need to help others go through those struggles and get women into a good position so that we can start making some of these changes. All right, I think that's plenty, especially for a Friday afternoon. I think that'll help you with the rest of the learning objectives. All of this information is on the test that you will experience next week. So thank you for staying with me. Enjoy your weekend. And we will see you at the beginning of next week.